recording. And what I first need to say is that it is quite an honor and an unusual thing where a fan of somebody's work gets to actually meet the author. And for anyone who isn't familiar, you are the author of one of the best books on rock music that I've read, that I'm aware of. It's Season of the Witch: How the Occult Saved Rock and Roll.
That's incredibly high praise. Thank you.
And well worthy of it. I'm quite honestly. I think how I'd like to approach this is to actually ask you about the word occult, because as I was researching it and going back to your book today, when you type in occult into pretty much any website, it's usually associated with, devil worship, Satanism, things like that. And it doesn't sound to me like you were using it almost at all in that context. So if you could explain.
Yeah, sure. I mean, the sort of formal definition of the word is just to mean something that's hidden. To occult something, it's occulted, just means that it's hidden. But obviously, that's not how we use the term, really. And so what's interesting is that the term now really captures a whole spectrum of beliefs and practices and ideas, everything from somebody just using tarot cards, a Wiccan practitioner, ceremonial magic, yes, devil worship, if such a thing is, we want to argue is real in the way that people maybe think that it is. Certainly, there is a broad range of the way in which people believe in things like magic and the supernatural. But the occult typically tends to mean some range of practices or beliefs that have to do with the ways in which the human being kind of takes some control over their own spiritual destiny by way of certain ritual practices of some kind.
Right. And sorry, I think I just lost you in video form, but I can still hear you. I'm gonna get this fixed.
Yeah, I lost you. I can see myself, but I can't see you there.
Let me fix that in a second. But in the meantime, I do want to ask you, and this is about the let's say introduction to the book. And you mentioned that the first time you discovered, I guess, rock and roll, and especially this sort of potent occult infused rock and roll, was in the late 70s. And obviously you talk a lot about that. Could you tell me, first off, what your experience was, but also what the general framework was at the time, regarding the occult, how it was viewed, and how it was part of pop culture?
Sure, around that time, and I can speak specifically to the United States, and it's probably similarly in parts of Europe and especially England. But so, my introduction was really because I had older siblings, specifically an older brother, who was immersed in 70s rock culture. I was able to sort of spy, through his record collection,
Right.
what was actually happening. Before that, I just sort of listened to pop, top 40 pop music, which at the time was things like the Bay City Rollers. I'd like to listen to all my little plastic cheap, record player. My brother had the big stereo, and he had, and so my experience, as a kid, my experience with seeing something like an Alice Cooper record and listening to that, or David Bowie in particular, Led Zeppelin. It was obviously, let's, as much as we're going to talk about these other things, I want to make sure that, we say out, that this is great music, however so we're talking about great music. And none of this works, right? If the music itself isn't good. So especially at the time, and I personally think the 70s is probably is really the great decade. for rock and popular music. And so, to be exposed at a kind of a young age to that, and to see the way in which people were not only experimenting musically, but experimenting with the presentation of the music, right? The album cover art, the lyrics, the kind of public personas that people presented, it all lended this kind of air of mystique. And I don't think I was alone in the 1970s to feel like there was some hidden something, some hidden knowledge, some special, that these musicians had special access to something. And yes, because it's rock and roll, and because it's infused with sex and infused with sort of sounds that are loud and just often distorted, that whatever they're connected to could feel, especially for, say, a 6 or 7 year old kid, that it's something malevolent or evil or dangerous, I think is a better word, right? And so that was also definitely as a result of the pop culture, especially in the 1970s, where I think because the 1960s sort of psychedelic Aquarian dream didn't really come to pass, in the way that people had hoped, that, I mean, just sociologically speaking, a lot of really interesting and creative people were severely damaged, by drugs and alcohol, and just these kind of lifestyles that were in many ways part of sort of the 60s sensibility, even though it was a hopeful sort of, we're going to have peace, we'll end the war in Vietnam, we'll have equality,
right,
sexual liberation, all of that was, but there was this darker edge to it. And I think in the United States in particular, a few things happened that really darkened what the 60s meant, especially Charles Manson. This idea, Charles Manson, especially the idea that our sort of gurus were maybe actually nefarious, cult figures. I think maybe we put a little bit too much stock in it, but I do feel, and I think a lot of people will agree, that not too long after Woodstock, there was the stabbing at the Rolling Stones concert with
Altamont, right?
With Altamont, with the Hells Angels. And again, just suddenly, where was this other thing that the 60s was supposed to be? Now it's Manson and Hells Angels with knives. It just didn't feel the same. And so, whereas the spirituality of the 60s, and even the occult spirituality of the 60s, was sort of more brightly lit and psychedelic, by the time we're moving into 70s, at least from the pop culture, it's not necessarily the way people were practicing magic or the occult, but at least from the pop culture, things really did take this dark turn. So have a lot more TV shows and movies about the devil, Satan, The Exorcist, of course, is a really important example of that. There was a made-for-TV movie about these kids who worship Satan in their attic, and their beloved family German Shepherd was the agent of the devil. So that was even just on our primetime television at home. This was sort of the atmosphere of what a non-mainstream Judeo-Christian spirituality really looked like. It wasn't the Dayglow 60s, psychedelic, Eastern mystical, right? It was something much darker and untoward and probably malevolent.
And you also get, I guess, let's call it the pop rock elements that sort of infused with that as well. Your Kiss and Alice Cooper that you mentioned, that obviously they do have a darkness, but they're also a bit showy and campy. I don't think that's an insult to
Exactly.
call it that.
That's right. No, exactly. Yeah. And so I do think that those bands and other musicians sort of embraced that darker sensibility, right? Because it was very commercially successful to do so. And that's why I think it's also important when we talk about the occult that we're not talking about, when I use the word, I'm not talking about, at least for the purposes of, you know, the way in which we're discussing it, that there is an actual force at work, and, you know,
Right.
secret conspiracy of powerful things. I'm talking really just about something like a pentagram, and you know, that a musician is inspired by it in one way, but the parents of the kid listening to it also think about it in a certain way. And in a more cynical way, I think many managers and promotional people took advantage a little bit of that, right, to sell records. But I also think that something else was happening, which is that if you're an artist and your music and your lifestyle are pushing up against the mainstream and pushing up against what's considered sort of traditional, it only makes sense that the things you would reach for to define your own inner spiritual life would be things that themselves feel like they're pushing up against what's normal, right? So it seems perfectly reasonable that somebody like Jimmy Page would become fascinated with Aleister Crowley. Of course, right? I don't think it's
which, to be fair, he seems to have generally had an interest in this, not just a cosmetic one, but
that's right. Yes,
right.
That's right. But of course he would. I mean, he's somebody who, you know, was a young man who was literally changing the history of rock music. You know, like, yeah, while he was doing it, he was changing pop culture. He was absolutely could feel why somebody like Crowley's ideas about will and a libertine lifestyle, you know, not caring what the church thinks of you, not right, developing your own spiritual practice that puts you in charge, not a priest or a rabbi or a guru, right? It puts you in charge of your own destiny. I mean, of course, that's going to be something that Page would see as inspiring to him, right? So I think that as much as there was sort of a pop culture sort of luridness, but also fear of these things, and there were also musicians and record labels that were sort of excited about how to monetize and take advantage of that, there were, in the midst of that, musicians that were also serious about how these ideas and these practices could inform them as artists.
Right.
Yeah.
Sorry to cut you off. I really love that the book is obviously very well informed and very serious, but it also has a comedic tone to it at points, which I think the subject does deserve.
Absolutely, yeah.
Because there are quite a few odd instances and a few odd characters along the way. But you mentioned the idea that probably in most cases it wasn't like a nefarious plot that the audience wasn't aware of. But at the same time, and I'm wondering, was this also a ploy? Because, for example, Crowley, just Crowley, he gets name checked on Sgt. Pepper on the album cover. He gets name checked by Jimmy Page, and you also mentioned, which I didn't know, that Sting on the Police album cover has an image of Crowley. I hadn't noticed that, I think.
Actually, no, I don't think it's an album cover. It's a photograph taken by Stuart Copeland. in a book of photographs that he took of just, and it's a photo of Sting reading I think that's what it is. But again, it's Sting, right?
Right,
It's
right.
still this, yeah.
So, but that's the thing, I guess, if you were that kind of obsessive fan, just looking for clues, you'd sort of find traces of this, and they're not exactly obvious. So one might argue that naturally you'd make a connection that there's some sort of a supernatural conspiracy.
Of course, of course. And for some people, they might think that's awesome that there's a supernatural conspiracy at play, but some might think, especially for maybe very conservative or evangelical Christians, that that's a problem, all right, that needs to be fought against. And so, and I do think that tension in some ways is what gave us a lot of really cool music and ideas, because people really wanted to push play around the edges of this. I mean, we see that sometimes taking on a very nasty turn. There was a time, and he absolutely moved past it and was sorry that it ever was a part of his life. But there was a time when Bowie seemed to be a public admirer of fascist aesthetics, right? And I think it's partly because he understood the hypnotic power of the performer, right? And in some ways, the hypnotic power of the performer is an act of magic, right? Because you're literally changing people's consciousness by way of some manifestation of your will, right? And I think he recognized the power of that, and who knows how much of it was the cocaine speaking, but he definitely blurred the edges there a little bit. Later in life, he was really, I think, embarrassed about that moment, and owned it, but so it's not always just, it might feel like play, but we see that later also with the British industrial underground, Throbbing Gristle, and where there was a kind, militant outfits, and obviously there, in the early days of punk, there was sort of an embrace of the swastika, but again, it was like it was an FU less than it was an ideology. The problem is that I think some people forgot that it was supposed to be just a rebellious thing and started to take on a life of its own, right? So I think that that's also important about the power of these symbols, and the ways in which musicians understood the power of these symbols. And so it gets to this other question of, is the occult real or not? Is magic real or not? Is less important than the relationship that we have with these symbols and how they immediately kind of key into something in our sort of lizard brain.
Right. I could share in regards to that. Maybe it makes sense, and I want to ask you what you think about it. As you mentioned, this was really good music at the heart of it. In Eastern Europe, one of the weird things, I guess, is that extreme metal, especially sort of the Scandinavian brand of black metal,
yes,
it's very popular, and it's always kind of confused me. I don't think it's particularly bad. I don't think it's particularly good.
I don't like the Cookie Monster vocals. I could never get past that.
Yeah. But there were all those stories which I guess turned out to be true about a couple of individuals who, there were some church burnings in Norway, and
yes,
the stabbing of one band member.
What was there was a book and a movie related to that, All the Light We Cannot See, or something like that. What was that?
Yeah, it's brilliant. Until the Light Takes Us, I think.
Yeah.
And actually,
Yeah.
I want to ask you about that, because I think my theory is that it's so popular in places like Eastern Europe because there was so much, there was such a lack of freedom that it seemed like, you know, these people were like the most extreme brand of rock there was at the time. But at the same time, the book that you mentioned and a couple of others, they kind of show that these kids from Norway, essentially they were kind of like rich, angry kids.
Yes.
There was little Satanism involved, really,
Right.
and it
Right.
kind of strips away the magic.
That's right.
Yeah, I'm
But
wondering.
in some ways, that's even more. Yeah, there's a lot of that. We see a lot of that in, privilege allows you to behave in a certain way, right? When you know that you might only even get a slap on the wrist if you are acting out. I think though that but I do think that that there are parts of that, there were certainly parts of that where people meant it in a way that continued to perpetuate, some of those ideas and some of the ways in which people responded to it, right? So nothing happens in a vacuum, right? On the other hand, though, we can't blame, like there's in the United States, and I think in England, there was this idea that Ozzy Osbourne was telling kids to commit suicide, right, via secret messages in that song, Suicide Solution.
Right.
And, how do you, so people are going to act out because they have an idea of the way in which they think things work. There's also then the exaggerated media about these things, like we had here in the United States, a Satanic Panic, we call it, in the 80s.
Right.
And it resulted in really, in many ways, a lot of innocent people's lives getting kind of ruined by that, right? People who weren't obviously in any way Satanists or anything. But at the same time, it also created a huge market, right, for the heavy metal band that's going to put a upside down pentagram on their album cover, right? So people will also play with the knowledge that these things are going to incite a certain reaction. And we could have a second conversation about, does the musician have any responsibility to what might happen as a result? But I don't want to go into that. But I think it's certainly a question people ask.
And do you think that the mainstream public's appetite for these kind of topics, that it's been a bit exhausted over the years? Because you mentioned in the book, and I thought it was very funny. I think I heard it before, that at some point D&D, Dungeons and Dragons, was targeted as this big, satanic insider,
Yes.
which sounds ridiculous to be honest, especially now when you have all these video games that are immensely popular. Some of them are being considered for the Olympics, and they essentially have characters resembling D&D characters and monsters and all sorts of creatures. How do you think the sort of the public's perception of that has changed? It's just gotten milder over time, and why do you think that is?
Well, I think it's changing generations, obviously, is a part of it, and I think but I also think that people have embraced it in a way that's changed the conversation. For example, there's always been people who practice witchcraft in England, United States, all over the world, and some of that witchcraft arises out of especially some things happening in the 50s and 60s. Gerald Gardner, a British magician who wrote a book called Witchcraft Today, and started a whole Wiccan movement. So a couple of other folks like that sort of helped carry this sort of new way of thinking about occult practice that was much oriented towards nature and gods and goddesses, without sort of that sort of darker devil aesthetic. And so that's always been with us. We also had the New Age movement, which I think was right around the Satanic Panic 80s time, but was also trying to change the conversation, where you had, middle class moms going to the store and buying crystals and getting their tarot read, or practicing yoga, right? All those, suddenly these non-Western or non-traditional spiritual practices are really become part of the pop culture now. So it's harder to say this thing is the devil when there's so many things that we would consider magic or the occult that obviously don't fit into that at all, that are very part of the pop culture. Right. But the other thing that happened here, I think, was with and this happens often during political kind of upheavals, but with the election of with Trump becoming president here in the United States, there was also a kind of spiritual response to that. That was a response having to do with magic. And we had, there's a fellow in the United States, his name is Mike Hughes, and he started a whole monthly lunar ritual to basically hex Trump. And he got, thousands and thousands of people would participate in this, virtual, ritual. Right. And more people were starting to take on, with, often witchcraft practices. But also on that side, there's a darker side to that also, as much as there's been a sort of what we would consider sort of a liberal sort of spiritual response. We've also had, and I think all over Europe too, an upsurge in what we might call occult groups that are taking on more of a right-wing sort of sensibility as well. Right. So you're always going to have, sort of that polarization. But I do think that generally it's harder to say that, unless you want to go with like the conspiracy route, it's harder for just like the media to call something satanic, because that word just doesn't really mean anything anymore in the way that it used to.
I should actually ask, I have so many things I do want to ask you, but one of them is, I think you also wrote a book about, I guess, the human quest for meaning in a spiritual sense. And I'm wondering, is the word Satanism, as you mentioned it, occult, things like that, did they work particularly well, or were they especially potent in that era where Christianity was still very popular? In most countries, it's decreased quite steadily in the last few years. Was that kind of the contrast in a way?
Yeah, I think so here, especially. But even though I'm not sure what the figures are, but the conservative Christian elements in this country still have incredible political power and clout, right? So what, even if it's a small percentage, it still has it still casts such a, if I use the word shadow, over American culture and politics. We have something here in the United States, the Satanic Temple, which is essentially it's a nonprofit organization that is very politically active. Right. And so, and if you ask them, they say they're atheists. They don't believe that Satan is an actual spiritual manifestation, right? But they have embraced sort of whatever they consider sort of those ideals of sort of freedom of thought and,
Are they the ones that managed to get the statue of?
Yes, exactly.
Right.
That's right. Exactly. Yeah. So you have a lot of that, but it's, and What I do think, though, that you have in terms of music culture, though, which is interesting, is it's less this kind of, you know, blatant sort of devils on your album covers, and more that there are just so many musicians now that really feel like they, I think, have incorporated a practice into their musical lives, you know. I mean, you still have bands here like Ghost, Ghost BC, right, which, you know, still do the Kiss-like Alice Cooper presentation. You have a lot of that. And there's some great bands, you know, that are still sort of borrowing from that 70s sort of occult, stoner rock sensibility, which, you know, I still love. But I think you're also finding more and more people, even popular musicians, you know, they're just speaking more openly about their own practices, where there was a time where that would have been scandalous, you know.
Right. I should ask you about this. And before I do that, I want to mention a very clever way in which the book is structured, is that it goes from the very beginning of rock and roll and its connection to the occult until the present day. It starts, for example, with Arthur Brown, and I want to ask you about that. But where it ends up is slightly farther away from rock. You talk about pop music and let's call it conspiracy theories that you sometimes see on the internet, small occult symbols that you occasionally see big pop artists using.
Like Madonna, yeah.
Right, yeah. And I'm actually wondering, this is just your opinion, if you think that's just like a clever nod and she thinks that's going to get her attention, or is it something else, like people that actually believe in this and they're trying to influence reality in a way?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely do, just personally, do not believe that there is any larger occult conspiracy at play in any of this. But I do believe that musicians like Madonna are incredibly clever, smart promoters and understand the power of these symbols, right? And understand the power of spectacle. And like I said before, I do think that that is an act of magic, right? I just don't think that it's, I don't think there's 7 or 8 people sitting around a table, you know, with a giant pentagram in the middle, organizing all of this, right? I think it's just that some artists have figured out that there's a lot of power in these ideas and in these symbols. And I'm not even sure I would say that they're necessarily exploiting them. I think that they are also inspired and interested in them, you know. So Madonna, during her Super Bowl halftime show, you know, comes out on a throne and she looks like the Empress of the Tarot deck. And that's awesome that she would bring that symbolism to bear. So whatever you think about her music, right? I mean, I think it's very cool. And I think what's even more interesting is she maybe knows that there are people that are going to respond to it in a certain way, think that she's an agent of the devil, and know that that might actually only increase her, you know, sales of her records or eyes on her video. You know, I mean, so there's I think it's both that she's embraced it for herself in a meaningful way, but also understands its commercial power.
Right.
I think not Alice Cooper, I think Ozzy Osbourne was somebody who understood that, but I don't think Jimmy Page cared about that. I think, you know what I mean? I think he really just wanted to make amazing music, obviously liked the aura that it kind of cast and helped sort of sell records. but I don't think he cynically exploited it in the way like, say, Madonna did or does. And maybe somebody like Ozzy Osbourne, who kind of, plays himself as being this devilish figure, but then when you ask him, about, he says, "Oh, I'm just playing a game. I'm just playing around,"
Right. Yeah. It's interesting because you mentioned, I'd be remiss not to mention Genesis Peerage.
Yes.
And a lot of the things introduced by Frobing Gristle and later by Psychic TV, things like the cut-offs and different occult elements, sigils, things like that.
Yes.
They were, I guess, kind of underground. But later on, especially during the late 80s and 90s, like you mentioned Ozzy, and later things like the industrial metal bands like Marilyn Manson and things like that, they used similar imagery, but maybe in a more commercially viable sense. So there's always that market of what is it gonna do it to sort of shock an audience. I guess that's never gonna change. It's just the line is gonna
that's right.
Get moved a bit.
That's right. When Psychic TV was asking people to masturbate on their sigils,
right,
I don't think they were looking for mainstream attention. They understood that they were, audiences. But I don't think that they saw but I also think they were just artists making their art in terms of the music. And if you get commercial success, great. But I'm not sure, it's just, it was just an authentic expression of, what it was that they were doing at the time. But yes, people then will take those symbols and use them in ways that become more about their commercial viability. But it's hard to also add intention to somebody. I mean, how much somebody believes it or how much they're just exploiting it for, just to get people riled up.
Yeah,
so It's hard to say. Yeah, I mean, I think also Bowie was somebody who understood that he was certainly a commercial beast. Like, you know what I mean? But he also was so self-aware of that, right? That you have things like Aladdin Sane and you have The Man Who Sold the World. I mean, it's just all part of, I think, the genius sort of his ability to use these ideas, turn them into these, obviously money-making performances, but still staying, I think, very authentically true to, I mean, it's amazing you can have a musician like Bowie, the level at which the level of his success and never really, I don't think, being able to say that he sold out.
Yeah, exactly. Were you surprised that I guess on his on his final album, on Black Star, he returned to a lot of, at least visually, a lot of those elements he'd quoted before?
I know, it's incredible. I mean, I think for him, it really was, even though we see these as distinct sort of moments, that he still saw it as all just aspects of his single self, right? All those characters, all those Major Tom, Ziggy Stardust, all of them, right?
Right, exactly. And I want to ask you in closing, because it's obviously times have changed, and as we mentioned, there's always going to be a new generation using occult symbols in different ways. But in the very beginning of the book, I think you begin with Arthur Brown, and himself calling himself the god of hellfire. He's still performing now, and I think he says that he's part of a tradition of performer. And I can also remember an interview when somebody asked Iggy Pop why his shows were so loud, and he said, it's part of a tradition of performance where you get something, not necessarily a mental energy, but a physical energy, a sensorial energy out. Where do you think that tradition is going to carry on going forward? Is it in fact something that's cyclical?
Yeah, I mean, I also think that they're also talking about something, especially Arthur Brown, that's very old. Obviously, it's still going, which is sort of a shamanic tradition, right? Where you are sort of using your body and your voice and sound and to carry some message of the gods or the spirits to your community, right? To the audience, right? And I don't think your message or what you're saying has to have anything to do with the occult for that to still be an actual phenomena, right? Iggy Pop is still doing that to the audience. Doesn't matter if he uses, any idea. So in some ways, the symbols are irrelevant to the actual interaction between the audience and the musician, right, or the performer. I think there are a few, I think we're going to see, I think we're already starting to see more of that. Their name escapes me. There's a band, I think that they're a Swedish band that does full ritual music. They wear sort of masks. And do you know the band that I'm talking about?
I might. I know there are a few Scandinavian bands that
It might be a Scandinavian band,
yeah,
that's doing that now. And I think you'll have that where it seems to be that they're drawing on very traditional, practices, but with a modern sensibility. And then bands like Ghost or even Sun, right, with all their sort of staging, and they turn the performance into a ritual experience. I'd like to see more of that. I think it's, I think the pandemic has totally shifted our whole idea of what performance is going to look like in the future. I mean, hopefully we'll all be back one day fully to what that live show can really be. But we might find that there's ways in which people are going to be doing that more with, online or virtual, maybe even virtual reality can be a way that before I would imagine, somebody like Bowie would have been somebody who, if he had still been alive and, in 15 years would have started to do something with VR, or something. So it's hard to say. So I think that the technology is there, and I think that that essential thing that's happening with a rock show, the key about this is that it's rock and roll. It's not the occult, but there's something about rock and roll that is perfectly matched to an occult sensibility, which is that the human being is in charge of their own spiritual fate, right? And that we can meet the gods face to face. We don't have to have a mediary like a priest, right? So I think that that's sort of the most important element of it for me.
And in closing, if you'll allow me a silly question, it's I was actually just speaking to a guitar player, a member of a band I play in, and he was really angry about a different band, not a very good one, that's very successful. And he said to me very seriously, these guys, they've definitely been doing some rituals to achieve success. Like there's no other way this could have happened. And it seems surprising to me because I didn't know he was interested in those sort of things, and B, he seemed completely convinced that this was a possibility. So for anyone watching and hoping that their a mediocre band becomes a tremendously successful group, would the occult be a possible solution?
Well, it's funny because if really what you're trying to do is change your inner consciousness, and that somehow makes you feel more powerful or makes you feel more, maybe it will actually make you more successful because you'll have the inner resources you need, but I don't know, Yeah, so I think that can you say who the band is, or I wouldn't know who they are?
They're pretty obscure. They're a local band. I would I can send you a link if you're interested.
Okay.
They're not particularly great.
But they're doing. You're saying that he's saying they're starting to suddenly become successful.
Yeah, and they have the one thing that is interesting about them though is that they have you know, they wear masks, and it's this
Yeah.
mixture of electronic music with their identities hidden. So I guess that's pretty clever.
Yeah. But is there any is it really a surprise that terrible music can still become popular?
Right, right.
I mean, I turn on the radio and hear that all the time.
Exactly. Yeah. So I guess that's one of the reasons why you know, conspiracy theorists would go. You know, they've definitely it's the Illuminati making them successful.
Yes. I guess if that's true, I still don't know to what end.
Right. Exactly. Exactly. Oh, listen, this was an immense pleasure, and I really do mean it. It's I've gone through a lot of books on rock and roll, and this is by far one of the most enjoyable. Season of the Witch, How the Occult Saved Rock and Roll. And if you could tell us in ending where people can find your book.
Yeah, really any online, and I'm sure their bookstores should be able to order it, but I do know that you can get it even outside of the US, and you know, in the UK, you should be able to secure a copy.
I did as well, so I can confirm that, and it was an amazing read. And thank you so much for your time and great thought-provoking answers.
Thanks for having me. Yeah, I really appreciate it. Great to see you.
This was brilliant. Thank you. Have a great day.
You too.